The smell hit them first. A thick, smoky warmth drifting through the wire. Not the sting of diesel or rot, but something almost unreal. Beef sizzling in iron pans, onions softening in butter, biscuits baking in tin ovens. A young Japanese nurse froze mid-step. She had survived bombings, starvation, and the slow humiliation of surrender. But this smell, broke something inside her. She turned toward the mess tent, her stomach hollow. Inside, American GIs, grinning and sunburned, sat at long benches. One leaned back, chewing a forkful of stew, and laughed, "She cooks like my wife." The others whooped, slapping the table. The cook, a Japanese woman in a plain apron, turned, stunned. For years, she'd been told she was less than nothing. Now, a cowboy in boots and a 10-gallon hat had compared her to someone he loved. She didn't know whether to cry or run. She only knew one thing. The world no longer made sense. The compliment hung in the air like steam rising from the pot, absurd, unexpected, and somehow more intimate than any interrogation. "She cooks like my wife." The American had said it with an easy drawl, fork still in hand, his mouth half full and grinning. Around him, the other soldiers chuckled, more amused than mocking. But the Japanese woman in the apron stood frozen, ladle dripping stew back into the pot, as if that sentence had cracked something loose inside her ribs. The kitchen was warm with the heat of open flames and iron stoves, and yet she felt a sudden chill. The mess area had been built with surprising care, long wooden tables, sanded, smooth, a line of cast-iron pots suspended over coals, and beneath the smoke-darkened tent flap, American soldiers passed bowls down the line like a family dinner. For weeks, the Japanese women had watched this ritual from a distance, silent and wary. Then, one morning, the camp commandant gestured toward them and nodded. A translator relayed the order. Volunteers could help prepare food. Voluntary, he had said. That word alone felt alien. The women exchanged glances, hesitant, suspicious. What did they mean by help? Would they be forced to scrub floors, to stir tasteless rations, to peel endless buckets of potatoes under watchful eyes? But when she stepped into the camp kitchen for the first time, she was greeted not with barked orders, but with the sharp aroma of spices and a cowboy-hatted GI tipping his hat toward her with a half-smile. He pointed to a bowl of flour, then to his own apron, exaggerated a rolling motion, and said, "Biscuits." She didn't understand the word, but his tone was light, almost playful. She kept waiting for the cruelty to come, for the ridicule, the shouting, the slap of a hand. Instead, he handed her a rolling pin. She didn't speak English, and he didn't speak Japanese, but somehow they made biscuits. There was no way to reconcile what was happening. The camp's fences still stood, barbed and tall, casting long shadows. Soldiers still patrolled with rifles. But inside the kitchen it was as if a different set of rules applied, a pocket of suspended logic. The Americans were loud and strange, yes, but not cruel. They showed her how to stir the gravy without burning it, how to roast beef slowly until it fell apart with a spoon. When she mismeasured salt, one of them made an exaggerated coughing face, then laughed, waved it off, and added a splash of water to balance it. It wasn't mercy that unsettled her most. It was familiarity. And then came the moment. That sentence, that awful, bewildering sentence. "She cooks like my wife." It wasn't meant to be political, she could tell. There was no edge to his voice, no irony. It was simply true, and that made it worse. Because in that one line she had been pulled out of the gray zone of prisoner and enemy, and dropped, however briefly, into a different category entirely. A woman like his wife, a woman who could cook something that tasted of home, The recognition didn't feel generous. It felt dangerous. She had spent years being stripped of identity, first by the empire that taught her obedience was virtue, then by the war that taught her silence was survival. And now, in a place where she had expected to be broken, she was being seen. That night, she lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the smells of the kitchen still clinging to her hair. Across the room, another woman whispered, "Did you hear what they said?" No one answered, but they had all heard. The air in the barracks was thick with unspoken questions. What did it mean to be praised by the enemy? What did it mean if their food, a skill passed down by mothers and grandmothers, could reach across a fence and make someone remember love? The war had taught them to fear pain, but no one had warned them how much worse kindness could feel. That stew was just meat, potatoes, salt. And yet it stirred something deeper than hunger. She had been trained to brace for fists, not for compliments, taught to expect mockery, not warmth. The imperial code of Bushido had promised one path, to die rather than to be taken alive. Surrender was shame. Captivity was worse than death. Her instructors at the Auxiliary Academy had driven that into her spine with words sharp as bayonets. "The enemy is dishonor made flesh," one had said. "If they touch you, you will wish for death." And so she had whispered the oath, knees bruised against temple floors, vowing to protect her emperor's name, even if it meant starvation, torture, or silence. But now the silence in this camp was not the silence of death. It was the quiet of breakfast being served without shouting, of boots walking without stomping, of laughter that didn't hide violence. That morning she sat beside other women at a long bench, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee she had never tasted before. It was bitter, almost medicinal, but they drank it anyway. One woman blinked back tears, whispering, "How can we be alive?" Another answered, "Because the Americans feed us." And just like that, the guilt slithered in. She remembered the field hospital on the edge of Saipan, the stink of pus and iodine, the screams muffled behind linen screens. There, compassion had been rationed thinner than the rice porridge. When a girl collapsed from heat stroke, she was slapped until she stood. When a soldier begged for water, the nurse had been scolded for wasting supplies. "Suffering is loyalty," they had said. "Comfort is for the weak." But here in this strange corner of America, under a flag she had once been told to curse, they handed her soap that smelled of lavender, a blanket still warm from the sun, a plate with a piece of meat so tender it fell apart under her spoon. Each gesture chipped away at the fortress built inside her, and yet every kindness felt like a betrayal, not of her country, not even of her emperor, but of the women she had marched with, the ones who had believed, to their bones, that surrender was not an option. She had seen one slit her own throat with a broken mirror when capture became certain. Another had run into gunfire, not toward it, but into it, screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai," until the bullets made her quiet. They had died believing they were doing the honorable thing. Now, sitting at a wooden table in a foreign camp, she wondered if they had died for nothing. The hardest part was that no one mocked them here. The guards didn't leer. They didn't laugh when the women bowed automatically. They didn't curse when their English stuttered. That absence of cruelty was almost crueler than cruelty itself, because it left them no shield to hide behind. One woman refused to eat her stew. She let it go cold on the tray, then buried it under her blanket that night. "It smells like home," she said. "That's the trap." Another, older and thinner, snapped back, "Is it a trap if we're alive?" The question hovered in the air like smoke, unanswered. Some tried to rationalize it. Perhaps this was all a trick, a performance to earn their trust before something worse began. Others clung tighter to Bushido, repeating old mantras under their breath, like a spell to ward off comfort. But late at night, when the lights were low and the guards spoke in hushed tones beyond the barracks, the truth pressed in from all sides. The Americans were not behaving like monsters. And if the enemy is not a monster, then what is the war really about? One woman folded her apron at the end of her shift and stared at it for a long time. She had worn it while stirring a pot of beans that fed both prisoners and guards alike. "They said I have a good hand," she whispered, "for seasoning." She did not smile. She looked like she had been struck. None of them had an answer for the feeling blooming inside them, but they all knew its name: betrayal. Not of duty, not of country, but of a story they had once believed was unshakable, and it was cracking with every bowl of stew. The next morning the bell rang as usual, a hollow clang echoing across the dusty yard. The women rose without speaking, the rhythm of captivity already woven into their bones. But this morning a few of them were summoned early before roll call. The same translator stood by the mess tent and pointed gently. "Kitchen, you come help again." She almost didn't move, not because of fear, but because of the strange flutter of something she couldn't name. Anticipation, maybe. Inside the tent, the Americans were already at work. One soldier was elbow-deep in a sack of flour, dusting it over the counter like snow. Another whistled a low tune, tapping the side of a metal pot with a wooden spoon. The smell of simmering broth filled the air, layered with pepper, onions, something sweet she couldn't place. It reminded her of her mother's kitchen long before the war, when sugar was still legal and eggs were not powder. She took her place at the counter and began peeling potatoes, thin strips curling under her blade. Across from her, a GI with freckles and sunburned arms leaned on the table. "Y'all do this faster than we ever could," he said, then mimed a dramatic cramp in his wrist. She didn't understand the words, but the way he exaggerated made her laugh before she caught herself. He looked pleased. "There it is," he said, pointing at her face. "First smile all week." Cooking became its own strange ritual, a rhythm of work that blurred lines between captive and captor. The cast-iron pots hissed and bubbled. The fire crackled as dough rose in battered pans. There were no formal lessons, just gestures. A nod meant stir. A raised eyebrow meant taste. When one woman added too much salt to the gravy, the tall Texan with the drawl said, "Better than too little," and patted her shoulder like a coach after a good pass. Sometimes they worked in silence. Other times the Americans spoke to one another with the lazy slowness of people who knew no one was listening. Stories about wives, about trucks, about songs on the radio back home. And even though the women didn't understand, they listened anyway, pulled along by the cadence. It was during one of these afternoons that a soldier with dusty boots and a crooked grin said, "She slices onions just like my mama." The others chuckled, nodding as if it were obvious. "You ever seen hands like that? Look at that grip." And suddenly the woman, no older than 22, found herself being complimented not for duty, not for obedience, but for something human, something tender. Her hands, which had once packed morphine into dead men's arms, were now praised for slicing vegetables. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. In the Empire, a woman's worth was measured in silence and endurance. Here it was being measured in spoonfuls of stew, in crusts of golden cornbread, in the way the dough rose when she punched it down just right. One guard started calling her the Biscuit Queen, tapping his cap when she passed. Another sketched a cartoon of her holding a frying pan, smiling under the caption, "Tokyo's Top Chef." She kept the drawing tucked inside her apron pocket, but the warmth brought shame with it. Every compliment felt like a weight. How could she accept kindness while her homeland starved? How could she feel pride while her family scraped weeds from between sidewalk cracks in Tokyo for soup? One woman whispered in the barracks that night, "They don't see us as prisoners anymore." Another replied, "Worse, they see us as people." There was no script for this kind of war. Each day in the kitchen blurred the boundary a little more. The fire warmed their faces, the food filled their bellies, the Americans told jokes, the Japanese women eventually started laughing, and somewhere between peeling potatoes and folding biscuit dough, they stopped feeling like ghosts. For a few hours each day, they were not symbols, not enemies. They were just cooks in a kitchen, no shame, no banners, just flour on their hands. The announcement came with little ceremony. A translator stood in the yard after morning roll call and said, "You may write letters, home, to your families." The words didn't register at first. Letters? From here? One woman turned to another, frowning. "They mean, we can tell them we're alive?" The translator nodded. "One page, name, camp number. Keep it simple." In the mess hall, stacks of yellowed paper were laid out beside dull pencils and narrow envelopes. No one moved at first. For months they had lived with the belief that the outside world had forgotten them, or worse, remembered them only as shameful proof of defeat. Now, the idea that a letter could pass through enemy hands and still find its way across oceans and rubble seemed impossible. The young cook, the one they called the Biscuit Queen, sat down slowly and touched the paper like it might vanish. She wrote her name at the top, then stared at the blank space beneath. What could she say? That she was safe? That they fed her warm meals, let her bake bread, let her laugh? That American soldiers said she cooked like their mothers, their wives? She glanced across the table. Another woman was already writing, her head bent low, lips moving as she shaped each word with care. In the end, she wrote, "Mother, I am alive. I cook every day. They do not harm us. I miss home." She paused, then added, "They eat what I make. They smile. I don't understand it." She folded the page, unsure if she had said too much or not enough. Later that day, back in the kitchen, one of the GIs was trying to explain how to make gravy without lumps. He mimed whisking furiously with his whole arm, then made a face as if the spoon had caught fire. The Japanese women burst into laughter, real startled laughter that echoed off the tent poles. One dropped a spoon, another covered her mouth, and even the soldier chuckled along, red in the face but clearly proud of himself. It felt like something cracked open in that moment. Not a wall, but a window. And through it came something dangerously close to joy. That night, the laughter echoed in her memory louder than it had sounded in the tent. She pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the rafters above. She had laughed, openly, in front of Americans, in front of men who wore the uniform she had been taught to fear. And they had not punished her for it. They had laughed too, and that somehow made it worse, because she could not stop comparing it to the silence back home, to the cold efficiency of her old superior, who once slapped a nurse for smiling during a break. She remembered the way her own officer had ignored her for 3 weeks after she mistimed a medical report. Here, the men in charge called her by name, told her thank you, waved when she passed. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like betrayal of something sacred, or maybe of something that had never been real to begin with. In the following days, more letters were written. Some women described the meals, careful to say little more. Others admitted they had laughed. A few folded their papers in silence and never explained what they wrote. The guards never read them aloud. They simply collected them with quiet efficiency, slipping them into canvas mailbags with no ceremony. But the damage was already done. Because in writing down the truth, even a small truth, the women were forced to face it. Not all enemies are cruel, not all prisons have bars, and not all laughter is forbidden. And that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. The first time she heard it, she thought someone was crying. The low, drawn-out notes floated from the back of the mess tent, rising and falling like wind through a cracked door. She paused, bowl in hand, and listened again. It wasn't crying, it was singing, a man's voice, deep and slightly off-key, accompanied by the soft strum of a guitar. The words were English, unintelligible to her, but the tone was unmistakable. Longing. Two soldiers sat cross-legged near the stove, one holding a battered guitar that looked older than the war itself. The other sang slowly, the way someone might sing to a child at bedtime. The Japanese women paused in their chores, uncertain. No one ordered them to move. So they listened. The tune was simple, repetitive. One of the women found herself stirring stew in time with the rhythm. Another swayed slightly as she wiped a counter, unaware she was humming until a fellow prisoner shot her a glance. She froze, mortified, but no one said anything. Even the guards stayed quiet, their eyes distant, lost in whatever places the music had taken them. For women raised on military marches and patriotic chants, American music felt like a foreign wind, intrusive, strange, but it was also warm. Where the Empire's songs were sharp, rigid, full of command, these were soft-edged stories set to melody. The soldiers didn't sing of flags or victory. They sang about girls in old towns, about rivers, about walking home barefoot after a summer storm. It wasn't propaganda. It was something else. One song in particular came back again and again. "You Are My Sunshine." The men sang it often, sometimes drunk, sometimes slow and serious. The first time she heard the chorus, "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you," she felt something tighten in her throat. It wasn't the words, it was the tone, because she remembered something, suddenly and without warning, a street festival in her hometown before the war. Lanterns swaying, a boy from her school laughing, music from a bamboo flute carried over rice fields. Her mother's hand on her shoulder, the smell of grilled fish, and then it was gone. Memory was betrayal. She tried not to listen after that, but the music seeped in anyway. It was everywhere, on the lips of GIs peeling potatoes, in the quiet whistles of men mending fence posts, in the idle strums of guitars during lunch breaks. It followed her into the kitchen, lingered in the hallways, echoed in her dreams. One morning a soldier handed her a plate of biscuits and said, "These'll make you sing." She didn't understand, but the others laughed. That same day, a woman folded laundry to the rhythm of Home on the Range. Another tapped her spoon in time with a country tune. It wasn't defiance, it was unconscious. That made it worse, because the songs weren't about war. They were about homes the GIs missed, about wives who wrote letters, about children waiting on porches, and the Japanese women began to wonder. Not just what those lives were like, but if those women would recognize them, if they would be hated, pitied, understood, or simply forgotten. Music had crossed the fence they couldn't. One woman whispered one night, "I dreamt I was dancing." Another answered, "To what?" She hesitated. "The song about the sun." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. The contradictions settled deeper with each passing day. They were prisoners, yes, but in this strange world of soup pots and country songs, they were also something else. Not soldiers, not traitors, just women caught between two melodies, one of duty and one of memory. And the one that lingered longest was not the one they were supposed to remember. She hadn't realized she was gaining weight until her skirt began to tighten around her waist. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the way that good meals soften sharp corners. Her cheeks, once hollow, now held a faint flush. Her nails no longer cracked. Her hair no longer fell out in handfuls. It should have felt like healing, but it didn't. It felt like betrayal, because word was spreading. Through whispers, through Red Cross messages, through trembling hands that unfolded half-burned letters from home, Japan was starving. Cities, once lit with lanterns, were now reduced to soot. Rice was a memory. Children dug through ash, looking for weeds. One woman's sister had written, "We boil bark and pray." And here, in a camp on enemy soil, the stew was thick, the biscuits fresh, the fires warm. Each meal now came with a weight heavier than meat or bread. It was guilt, cooked into the very gravy they stirred, baked into every golden crust. They did not ask for seconds, even when offered. They ate slowly, chewing as if each bite might erase a memory. Some women began hiding parts of their meals, pretending they were saving them for later. But there was no later. There was only the now. And in the now, they were fed. One woman cried silently as she stirred cornmeal. No one asked why. Everyone already knew. The paradox carved itself into their bones. Back home, they had gone days on half a bowl of rice, watched neighbors drop in the street, their bellies distended from hunger. They remembered the taste of powdered ration paste, a bitter, grainy substance that clung to their teeth like guilt. Now they had stew seasoned with herbs, pork that flaked beneath their spoons, fried potatoes. "I weighed 75 pounds before I got here," one whispered. "Now I'm almost 90. She didn't say it with pride. She said it like a confession. And in the silence that followed, someone else asked the question that had been circling them like a ghost. "Are we prisoners? Or were we saved?" No one dared answer, because to say saved meant admitting that the captors had done what their own empire could not. It meant acknowledging that their survival, their flesh and blood and breath, was now owed to the hands of men they were supposed to despise. And that truth, heavier than hunger, sank into their chests like stones. The rebellion didn't begin with speeches. It began in the quiet moments, in the way a woman hesitated before bowing too low to a guard, in the way she corrected the soup seasoning without being told, in the way she tucked her apron like a professional, not a prisoner. These were small rebellions, internal ones, but they added up, because the hunger they carried was no longer just for food. It was for meaning. If they lived while others starved, was it their duty to feel shame forever? If they laughed while Tokyo wept, was it unforgivable? Or was there a different kind of honor, one found not in death, but in the quiet resilience of surviving when survival wasn't supposed to be possible? One woman wrote another letter. This time she said nothing about the food. She said, "I am alive. I think of you every day. I hope the war ends soon. I do not know who I am anymore." And that line echoed more truth than anything else, because in a camp where hunger had once ruled every thought, it was now identity they craved. Not just the past, but a place in a world that kept changing, a world where enemies fed you stew and called you miss when you passed by, a world where hunger no longer meant food, it meant answers, and none came. It began with a cracked bowl, a simple accident, the kind that should have passed without notice. One woman, tired, hands wet from scrubbing, let a ceramic dish slip from her grip. It shattered on the mess hall floor. The sound silenced the room. One of the American guards looked up, then chuckled softly. "No harm done," he said, waving it off like a cloud of smoke. But the silence on the Japanese side of the kitchen was not so easy to clear. "Pick it up," whispered a voice behind her, sharp, scolding. "You shame us." The woman who spoke was older, her spine stiff, her lips tight as rope. She had served in military hospitals, followed orders without blinking. She knelt to gather the shards, but her words cut deeper than porcelain. "They are feeding us like children, laughing at our clumsiness like we are pets. And you smile." The younger woman, the same one once called the Biscuit Queen, stared at her. "He wasn't mocking," she said quietly. "He was being kind." "That is worse," the older woman hissed. "They want us to forget who we are. They feed you stew and you forget rice. They say you cook like their wife and you forget Japan." And there it was, the unspoken wound torn open, because somewhere between the flower and the fire a deeper war had taken root, not between nations, but within themselves. Some clung fiercely to the old ways, believing that enduring in silence was the only form of dignity left. Others, younger, hungrier for meaning, began to question what dignity even meant when the world had collapsed. In Japan, they had been taught that cooking was sacred. A woman's hands in the kitchen were her quiet oath to the family, to serve without recognition, to provide without praise. Meals were made with the weight of expectation, not affection. Salt was rationed like secrets. And now, here in the land of their enemies, they stirred gravy and were told it was good. They roasted meat and were complimented like artists. They laughed and were not punished. One compliment had sparked it all. "She cooks like my wife." To the older woman, it had been humiliation disguised as praise. To be compared to an American housewife, a woman who wore lipstick and spoke back and had never boiled bark to survive, was to be stripped of all pride. But to the younger women who had only ever known cooking as obligation, that one line felt like something dangerous and new. It was acknowledgment. It was, dare they believe it, respect. The debate didn't end with shouting. It ended with silence, the kind that divides people in the same room. Over the next few days, the mess hall felt colder. Some women began declining kitchen duty, choosing instead to sweep or scrub latrines. Others continued to cook, quietly, like the work itself was proof of something deeper. But even in silence, the questions echoed. What is dignity? Is it defiance, or is it adaptation? Is it refusing to accept kindness from your captors, or learning to grow from it? The stew still bubbled, the fire still burned, but now every compliment, every smile, every casual ma'am from an American GI carried extra weight. Was it validation or a trap? The younger woman kept cooking, not because she believed she was free, but because she believed dignity could evolve, like dough rising, reshaped by warmth. And when she handed a GI a bowl and he said, "Best I've had all week," she nodded. Not with shame, not with pride, but with a quiet, steady grace. Because maybe, just maybe, dignity was not something they had lost. Maybe it was something they were still learning how to define. The invitation came folded neatly in the hands of a young translator. He stood at the edge of the mess tent, his uniform crisp, face unreadable. "You," he said in careful Japanese, pointing to the woman who had stirred stew like it was a prayer. "The officers would like you to cook for them." She blinked. "Me?" He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning. Their mess hall. You'll be escorted." The mess hall, for officers, sat at the far end of the compound, separate from the main kitchen, quiet and clean like a different world entirely. As she approached it the next day, flanked by 2 guards who didn't speak, her heart beat not with fear, but with something closer to disbelief. She had once dreamed of cooking in the grand kitchens of Tokyo for doctors, dignitaries, teachers, not American men in a foreign land. Inside, the kitchen gleamed, polished counters, sharp knives, real spices in glass jars, an open window where sunlight streamed in, warming the tiled floor. One officer, silver-haired and soft-spoken, greeted her with a nod. "You're the one who makes the biscuits?" he asked gently. She bowed. "Yes." "Well," he said, smiling as he handed her a folded cloth apron, "let's see what you can do with pie crust." There was no shouting, no barking of orders, no suspicion. Instead, there were recipe books, written in English, yes, but with pictures. She turned pages slowly, tracing illustrations of golden apple pies, braided bread, mashed potatoes shaped into swirls. On the counter lay photographs, women holding babies, kitchens full of flour, families gathered around tables. It didn't feel like war, and in that stillness something shifted. She wasn't being used, she wasn't being paraded. They were just curious, grateful, human. As she peeled apples for the pie, an officer handed her a measuring cup. "My wife always says I slice them too thick," he laughed. "You got someone waiting for you back home?" She hesitated. "My mother, my younger brother." He nodded. "Mine too. Can't wait to get back." He paused. "Funny, isn't it? We're here because of politics. But most days I just miss the smell of cinnamon and the sound of my front door closing at night." She didn't answer, but her hands kept moving. The pie was a small triumph. Browned edges, soft filling, no burnt crust. The officers clapped lightly when it was served. One asked for seconds. Another, wiping his mouth, said, "Reminds me of Missouri. You ever been?" She shook her head. "Only here." "Well," he said, smiling kindly, "this'll be one hell of a story someday." That night, back in her barracks, she looked at her hands, not for blisters, not for calluses, but for the faint scent of cinnamon still clinging to her fingertips. She had spent years believing she was a servant of the Empire, a soldier in a different kind of war. But here, in a stranger's kitchen, through borrowed recipes and borrowed peace, she had seen something else, a reflection, not of an enemy, not of a prisoner, but of a woman, one who loved her family, who knew the quiet power of food, who could, in another life, trade recipes with the very wives she had been told were devils. It did not erase the past, but it offered a mirror to the future. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't such a foreign place after all. If you're finding this story powerful, leave a like and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. The next morning, when she stepped into the officer's kitchen again, something felt different. The guards who usually flanked the door were missing. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a wall clock and the low simmer of stew she had set on the stove earlier. She wiped her hands on her apron, glanced around, and only then noticed it. The back door, slightly ajar, drifting open with each soft breeze. For a moment she froze. No guard, no watchful eyes, no bolt sliding into place, just an open door leading out toward the trees that bordered the compound. Beyond them, she knew, were roads, then towns, then a world she no longer recognized but had once called her own. She stepped closer. Not enough to flee, just enough to look. The sun outside made the grass glow gold. A bird hopped near the threshold, tilting its head as if confused by her stillness. Freedom had never looked so quiet, so ordinary. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears. If she walked through that door, she wouldn't get far, but perhaps far enough to feel wind on her face without barbed wire cutting the sky. Her fingers tightened around the ladle she held. The stew behind her bubbled gently, releasing a warm scent of pepper and onion, the same stew an officer had asked her to prepare for that evening's meal. It was her dish, her responsibility. She turned back toward the stove. Why? The question struck her like a blow. Why stay? Why not run? Why not choose the freedom she had been robbed of for so long? She lifted the lid from the pot and stirred. Slow circles, steam rising. Her reflection trembled in the surface. Not a soldier, not a servant, not a prisoner. Just a woman with a choice. And somehow the choice felt larger than escape. She understood then, with a clarity that cut through her like a blade. Dignity did not always wear a uniform. It did not sit in the posture of an officer or the commands of an emperor. Sometimes it lived in the smallest acts, in keeping your word, in finishing what you began, in refusing to be ruled by fear or hatred. If she ran, she would not be running home. She would be running back into a war that had swallowed everything she loved. But if she stayed, if she stirred the stew until it thickened just right, then she chose for herself, not for captors, not for leaders, not for ideology. She chose because she wanted to. Outside, a breeze rustled through the open door. She felt it brush her cheek like a hand offering a farewell she wasn't ready to accept. She stepped forward, not toward the opening, but toward the counter where apples still waited to be sliced. Her hands moved with calm purpose, steady as a heartbeat. She closed the door gently with her foot as she worked, not out of fear, not out of obedience, but because she did not need it open. Hatred had been a prison long before any fence. Leaving it behind felt more like freedom than anything that waited beyond the trees. And when the officers returned later, laughing and loud as always, they found her exactly where she had chosen to be, stirring the stew, the kitchen warm with the scent of apples and cinnamon, the door quietly closed, the world outside unchanged, and her heart changed entirely. She did not know the war had ended until the guards lined them up beneath a sky streaked with late summer clouds and said the ships were coming. There was no triumph in their voices, no celebration, just a solemn acknowledgment. The world had shifted again, and they were being sent back into it. The women stood in rows, clutching the few items they had been given: a blanket, a bar of soap, sometimes a tin of biscuits wrapped in paper, tokens of a place that had defied everything they once believed. The journey home felt longer than the voyage to America ever had. They crossed an ocean twice, but this time the water felt heavier, as if it carried every contradiction they'd gathered in the camp kitchens. When the coastline of Japan finally emerged from the mist, a hush fell over the deck. Home, but not the home they remembered. The port was ruins. Charred skeletons of buildings leaned over the shoreline, twisted by firestorms. Women with hollow cheeks stood behind wagons begging for rice. Children with shaved heads and swollen bellies picked through the rubble for scraps of metal they could trade. The air smelled not of salt and cedar, but of ash, as if the entire nation had been burned into a single long exhale. One woman stepped onto the cracked pier and whispered, "How can we return to a place that no longer exists?" Their families greeted them with tears, disbelief, and silence. Mothers cried into their daughters' shoulders, whispering prayers of gratitude. Brothers stared, gaunt and bewildered, unable to reconcile the fuller faces of their returning sisters with their own hunger. Rumors spread quickly. The former POWs had eaten American bread, tasted meat, even laughed with their captors. Some relatives asked quietly, "Is it true?" Others did not ask at all. At night, the survivor lay beneath a patched futon in what remained of her childhood home. Half a roof, 3 standing walls, a floor scattered with dust. She listened to the wind, trying to replace it with the sounds she once heard in the mess tent. Guitars thrumming softly, men humming country tunes, laughter echoing between pots and pans. But the wind here carried no melody. Only the cold truth of a land trying to stand again after losing everything. She dreamed of stew, thick, hot, full of flavors she had never known before captivity. She dreamed of kneading dough beside American soldiers who teased one another over burned batches of biscuits. She dreamed of an officer leaning over a pie she baked and saying, "Just like home." In the morning she felt ashamed for dreaming it, and yet she could not unremember it. What did it mean to be treated with dignity by the enemy? What did it mean that kindness had come not from the empire that demanded her loyalty, but from the men she had been taught to fear? One evening, as she sorted through what few belongings survived the bombings, she found her small journal, the one she had kept hidden in the barracks. On the final page she had written, in shaky handwriting, "They said I cook like their wife. I don't know what that makes me." She read the sentence again and again until the ink blurred. It was not a question about cooking. It was a question about identity. She was no longer simply a daughter of Japan, nor merely a prisoner who survived America. She had become something in between, someone reshaped by both fire and kindness. The world she returned to was ash, yes, but inside her something stubborn still burned. A recognition that dignity was not handed down by nations, but discovered in the quiet spaces where humanity surfaces unexpectedly. Over stew, over music, over a back door left unlocked. And though she could not explain it to anyone, she carried the truth like a hidden ember. She had been seen, not as an enemy, not as a number, but as a woman, equal in hands, in hunger, in hope. And that, more than anything else, was what she took with her into the long road of rebuilding. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment with where you're watching from. We read every one,